you have to be selfish if you're a person that's rich, that's making money, and you don't want to pay your fair share of taxes. Well, when you think about the billionaires in the city of New York, they make up about 48% in terms of the amount of taxes that they dole out compared to the average American, compared to the rest of New Yorkers. And if you're talking about raising their taxes while doing these other things, you're making New York unattractive, not just for residents, but for businesses.
Stephen A. responds critically to Zohran Mamdani and Democratic leadership during a televised segment.
85% of the population lives there. That's where I live. That's why I'm on POTUS. That's where we live. We ain't veering one way or the other to the extreme because we understand, it is about affordability, but it's also about the economy. It's also about safety in the streets. And when you're talking about the combination of a free bus rides or free grocery stores, and oh, by the way, less police, or at least not more police officers, and not prioritizing law enforcement in the streets of a city, of a state, of the United States of America, you got a problem.
The outspoken sports commentator delivered a pointed critique, highlighting what he views as vulnerabilities in the DNC's latest strategy to regain ground from Donald Trump and the Republican Party. His remarks were direct and forceful. Subscribe and join us as we take a closer look.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me be very, very clear. If the Democratic Party becomes the likes of Zohran Mamdani, who, by the way, I like, not trying to throw any shade on him or anything like that, but if the Democratic Party becomes him, you have no chance. You have no chance on a national basis in terms of the presidency. In Senate seats in the House, you have no chance. You have no chance. I want to be very, very clear about that. You might have a Democratic socialist sprinkled here and there, but that ain't what America is. America's about capitalism. America's about dollars and cents. America's about an economy, a flourishing economy. Okay? And you know what it's not about? Free stuff.
From the very beginning, Stephen A. sharply criticized DNC leadership for promoting Mamdani as a rising national figure. Following his victory in the New York mayoral race, Mamdani has received extensive media attention, appearing frequently across political coverage and cable discussions. According to Stephen A., the visibility feels deliberate, suggesting preparation for a potential 2028 presidential campaign. However, he argues that such a strategy could face serious challenges with voters. In his assessment, Democratic leaders risk misreading the broader electorate, while some progressive voices emphasize expanded government programs and ambitious policy proposals. Many everyday voters may interpret those priorities differently, focusing instead on concerns about taxation, accountability, and economic stability. Stephen A. maintains that voters are primarily seeking opportunity, steady leadership, and practical solutions grounded in real-world concerns. He concludes that elevating Mamdani to a national platform could become a significant strategic test for the party moving forward.
I like Mamdani. I'm looking forward to interviewing him. He's promised to be on this show. But I'm very, very concerned about some of the things that he said. I'm very concerned about what he once said about defunding the police. I'm calling 911. I'm being real with you. I'm calling 911. That's what I'm doing. I don't want to see less police officers. I want to see more police officers. I heard him talk about mental health experts in the subway system. I don't care about that. I want cops in the subways in New York City, where I was born and raised. Born in the Bronx, raised in Queens. That's what I want. I want to hear about no damn mental health experts in subways. Nah, I'm not trying to hear that.
Stephen A. then explains why he believes Mamdani would face serious difficulties on a national stage, offering a direct assessment of the political risks involved. A central focus of his argument is Mamdani's past support for reducing traditional policing models. Stephen A. characterizes that position as highly controversial in the context of a presidential campaign, especially when public safety remains a major voter concern. He references proposals in New York to shift certain responsibilities from police officers to mental health professionals in subway systems. While such ideas are often framed as reform-oriented and compassionate, Stephen A. argues they could be perceived by some voters as unrealistic in high-pressure environments where safety is a priority. In his view, public safety remains a defining issue for many Americans. When concerns about crime intensify, he suggests, ideological debates tend to fade, and voters prioritize stability and security above all else.
2% tax on the rich. Okay, fine. 11.5% capital gains tax on its face. Okay, fine. Free buses, free grocery stores in each borough. Really? Really think that's going to work? Ladies and gentlemen, we're at a crossroads in this nation, and there's no way to. And the level of vitriol that you see amongst the American citizen is because, God forbid, that you have a difference of opinion. It's not enough to agree. You know, people have to be disagreeable.
Stephen A. then turns his attention to Mamdani's broader economic proposals, focusing on plans to significantly increase taxes on high-income earners. He argues that such measures often trigger resistance from businesses and affluent residents, some of whom may consider relocating to lower-tax states. In his assessment, this dynamic risks shrinking the local tax base rather than strengthening it, potentially affecting the very communities the policy intends to support. He also critiques proposals to introduce publicly operated grocery stores across parts of the city. While supporters frame the idea as compassionate and aimed at expanding food access, Stephen A. questions its long-term fiscal sustainability. From his perspective, heavy government involvement in competitive markets can discourage private investment and alter market dynamics. He contends that policies that appear promising in theory must also withstand real-world economic pressures, emphasizing the importance of balancing social goals with practical financial outcomes.
And if you're talking about raising their taxes while doing these other things, you're making New York unattractive, not just for residents, but for businesses. And if you make it unattractive for businesses and you compromise the ability to be the capitalists that these people are, then they take their businesses elsewhere. So the money that they paid on their homes or in rent, they move out of the city or the state. Businesses follow. And ultimately the tax burden falls on to New Yorkers out there.
Some residents have chosen to leave New York City, citing rising living costs and increasing tax burdens as key factors in their decisions. As certain higher-income households and businesses relocate to lower-tax states, jobs, investment, and revenue can follow. Critics argue that when this happens, the remaining tax responsibility may fall more heavily on middle-class and working-class residents who are less able to move. Opponents of Mamdani's agenda contend that such policies risk weakening the city's long-term economic foundation. They point to concerns about reduced investment, strained public services, and slowing growth if capital continues to exit. In this view, gradual population shifts and fiscal pressure can create compounding challenges over time. According to Stephen A., major cities rarely decline suddenly. Instead, he suggests sustained policy missteps and prolonged economic strain can slowly erode stability, leaving a city struggling to maintain the prosperity it once enjoyed.
Which means that rent freezes, which is also something that Mamdani pushed, is that really going to be plausible? Are you really going to be able to freeze rent? Or are you going to end up hiking it because you don't have enough people here to pay it? Tax revenue, where you getting that from? See, these are all the kind of things that we have to connect the dots and ask ourselves, 1 + 1, does it equal 2? Is it really plausible that these things are going to happen? According to Mayor Hochul, 90% of the stuff Mamdani said he can't do on his own. He got to come through her and the state legislature in order to get it done. Is he going to be able to do that? What level of support is he going to have outside of young whippersnappers out there who love him and are so in love with his personality and everything else that they didn't really dot the I's and cross the T's and look at actual policies and the kind of effect that's going to have on New Yorkers? That's what I'm worried about. I hope I'm wrong.
Stephen A. also raises a structural point about how state government factors into the equation. For Mamdani's broader proposals to move forward, they would require approval from Governor Kathy Hochul. Without that support, many campaign promises could stall at the state level before implementation. If key elements are blocked or significantly revised, Stephen A. argues it could create political challenges, particularly if voters perceive a gap between campaign messaging and tangible results. At the same time, he suggests that if sweeping proposals were enacted quickly, critics would closely scrutinize their economic and public safety impact. In his view, this dynamic creates political pressure from multiple directions. Limited progress could raise questions about effectiveness, while rapid policy shifts could spark broader debate about consequences. Stephen A. frames the situation as a complex balancing act, where timing, feasibility, and public perception all play significant roles in shaping long-term momentum.
I'm looking forward to sitting down and interviewing with them. I just want to know where the money coming from. See, I count. Okay, I count. And I can't tell you how many young teenagers it could be daughters, it could be nieces and nephews, it could be friends and family members or relatives of folks along that age gap. And you're asking the same question. And you know what you come up with? The people who love Mamdani the most are not people who pay bills every day. I'm not saying that applies to everybody. I'm not applying that. But they certainly not people that pay bills every day all the time. You don't see business owners clamoring to support them. I'm just saying these things are important to bring up.
Stephen A. delivers a pointed warning about the broader political implications. He argues that if Democrats were to position Mamdani as a national presidential contender, it could intensify divisions within the party itself. According to his analysis, some business owners, entrepreneurs, and professionals may interpret Mamdani's economic rhetoric as unfavorable to private investment and long-term growth. From that perspective, proposals involving higher taxes or expanded regulation can raise concerns about competitiveness and economic predictability. At the same time, other voters are drawn to expansive government programs and stronger public guarantees, viewing them as necessary tools to address inequality and rising costs of living. Stephen A. suggests that these differing priorities reflect a deeper philosophical divide over the role of government in economic life. In his view, elevating Mamdani to the national stage could bring those tensions into sharper focus. Rather than unifying competing factions, he cautions such a move might amplify internal disagreements over economic direction and electoral strategy.
But the reason I bring that up is because their campaign was a bit different than Zohran Mamdani. They were talking about affordability issues just like he was. But they were also a bit more pragmatic in their thinking. They weren't talking about free grocery stores and free bus rides. They weren't talking about those things. They were talking about centrist kind of policies that would ingratiate themselves with the vast majority of American citizens in their respective states, because guess what? They recognize that's where the meat of the electorate.
Stephen A. contrasts Abigail Spanberger's approach with Mamdani's, emphasizing what he sees as significant differences in governing philosophy. Both, he notes, begin with the same concern: affordability pressures affecting families, including rising rents, higher grocery prices, and increasing daily expenses. According to Stephen A., however, their solutions diverge sharply. He characterizes Spanberger's message as focused on tax relief, regulatory reform, and reducing bureaucratic barriers to encourage housing development and market competition. In this framing, the goal is to lower costs by improving how existing systems function, relying primarily on private sector incentives. By contrast, he describes Mamdani's proposals as favoring a more expansive government role, including higher taxation and publicly driven programs. In his view, these competing strategies represent fundamentally different visions for economic management.
And when you're talking about the combination of a free bus rides or free grocery stores, and oh, by the way, less police, or at least not more police officers, and not prioritizing law enforcement in the streets of a city, of a state, of the United States of America, you got a problem. You got a problem. And so now we got to sit up here and we got to ask ourselves, where are we going from here? Where you going to find yourself? What you going to do? Because we got a shutdown going on.
Stephen A. delivers a firm warning to Mamdani, arguing that national campaigns are decided by broad coalitions rather than ideological basis. He references past elections as examples of how candidates can struggle when their messaging is perceived as appealing primarily to activist circles rather than centrist voters. According to Stephen A., most Americans identify neither to the far left nor the far right, but instead prioritize practical concerns such as economic security, public safety, and cost of living. He contends that successful candidates tend to frame their platforms around those everyday issues in ways that resonate with middle-of-the-road voters. Using Donald Trump as a case study, he notes that messaging focused on the economy, border policy, and household expenses proved electorally effective. In his view, without appealing to moderates, independents, and working families, any presidential campaign would face significant structural hurdles.
How long you think that's going to last before disorder reigns? You can't do this to American people. You can't do it. Now I know that we've seen politicians say all of these things and address some of these things, but I ain't satisfied the fervor with which it's been addressed, because the shutdown is still going on. And needless to say, the president chimed in, because a lot of people chimed in.
In closing, Stephen A. Smith offers a sharp assessment of Mamdani's political outlook, arguing that several of his policy positions could face significant resistance. He points to proposals involving higher taxes, policing reforms, and expanded public services as areas likely to generate debate among both business leaders and middle-class voters. According to Stephen A., if policies are viewed as overly aggressive or economically disruptive, they may contribute to population shifts and investment concerns within New York. He suggests that such trends, if sustained, could influence the city's broader economic and political trajectory. On a national level, he notes that any presidential campaign would require navigating state-level leadership, appealing to moderate voters, and building a coalition broad enough to compete in general elections. Comparing different political styles, he argues that strategies perceived as pragmatic often attract wider support. His conclusion is that without adjustments in messaging and policy emphasis, the path forward could become increasingly challenging. If you found this analysis helpful, consider subscribing for more in-depth political coverage.